Have you ever, as a philosopher, wondered if those ancient Chinese thinkers way back when were wrestling with logic and language in ways that, well, kind of still resonate with us today? Like, did they bump into some of the same fundamental problems that we are still trying to figure out?
Oh, absolutely. That's a great question, and it's exactly what we're going to dig into today. This deep dive, we're heading straight into early Chinese philosophy,
Right.
specifically their views on logic and language. And we've got a fantastic guide for this journey, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on logic and language in early Chinese philosophy.
It's a really thorough piece, and we're going to try and unpack it in a way that, well, makes sense for someone like you, someone who loves getting into the nitty-gritty of philosophical questions. So think of this as like a crash course on this fascinating area of philosophical history, but without all the jargon and unnecessary detours.
The Stanford Encyclopedia entry is really helpful because it really focuses on this school of thought called the Mohists. And they were super interesting because they were having these intense debates with other schools like the Confucians and the Taoists about the nature of logic and language, what it is, how it works, what it's for.
So to kick things off, let's talk about one of the initial challenges in understanding the logical thinking of early Chinese philosophers. Sadly, we've lost a bunch of key texts, especially writings from the later Mohists. This, combined with the idea that their philosophical interests were like totally different from those in the West, meant that their logical contributions were kind of overlooked for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for a good while, Western scholarship didn't really grasp just how sophisticated the logic was in early Chinese philosophy. And you're right, the missing texts, especially those from the later Mohists, who really developed some advanced thinking around the 3rd century BCE, well, that was a big part of the problem. Then, fast forward to the late Qing dynasty, those lost writings started to resurface.
And that changed everything, didn't it? Suddenly we had access to all this intricate philosophical work on logic, epistemology, metaphysics, the philosophy of language, all this stuff that had been like hidden for centuries. Pretty exciting stuff for anyone interested in the history of philosophy.
Oh, totally. Before these texts reappeared, the common view was that early Chinese philosophy was mostly about ethics and how to run a society, with less focus on logic. But the later Mohist writings showed that, no, they were definitely grappling with those abstract logical ideas. In fact, they treated logic and language as subjects worth studying in their own right, which is that's pretty unique for that time in Chinese intellectual history.
So if they were so into logic and language, what was driving that? It couldn't have just been an intellectual exercise. Right?
No, definitely not. It was all tied up with practical concerns like, developing ethical theories that made sense and figuring out how to create a stable and just society. They weren't just messing around with abstract ideas. They wanted to use those ideas to build a better world, I guess you could say.
And one of the things that I think is particularly interesting for a philosopher is, how the Mohists criticize the Confucians for relying so heavily on authority. So for someone used to questioning everything, that's got to resonate, right? Can you unpack that Mohist perspective a bit more?
Sure. So the Mohists, they weren't too keen on the Confucian idea of like basing your ethics on tradition and what some wise guy from the past said. They wanted something more solid, more universal. They were all about utility and impartial care. And they believed you needed reason to back those principles up. And that, of course, led them to, dig deep into logic and figure out how to use language effectively to argue for their positions. They were all about constructing rock solid arguments, not just appealing to what someone said a long time ago.
And then you've got the Taoists who come in with this completely different view, right? They were pretty skeptical about objective standards, which, kind of throws a wrench into the whole idea of logic and language trying to establish those standards in the first place.
Right. The Taoists, especially Zhuangzi, he was really challenging that whole notion of like fixed objective standards for ethics or for understanding the world. For him, language was always going to fall short of capturing the true nature of reality. It was too rigid, too limiting. So that skepticism really pushed the Mohists, forced them to refine their theories even more. They were trying to find a solid foundation for their ideas amidst this radical questioning of language itself.
Now, there's this other group, the School of Names, and they were known for their, incredible debating skills. But there's this debate about whether they were brilliant logicians or just clever sophists. How should a philosopher today view their contribution?
Yeah, that's a tough one. They were definitely masters of argumentation. I mean, they could construct and deconstruct arguments like nobody's business. Some people saw them as like these intellectual giants pushing the boundaries of reason. But then others, including the Mohists, thought they were more interested in like word games and tricks than in genuine understanding.
So would you say they were like the philosophical trolls of their time, poking and prodding others to sharpen their own arguments?
Huh. Yeah, maybe something like that. Whether their arguments were always sound is still up for debate, but their impact was like huge. The later Mohists, especially, seem to be responding directly to a lot of the paradoxes and puzzles that the school of names threw out there. So it's quite possible that, trying to counter these guys actually led the Mohists to develop some of their most important ideas about logic and language.
Now, one thing that really jumps out at me as a philosopher is that early Chinese philosophers, particularly the Mohists, didn't really separate formal logic from the semantics of language, this concept of Ming or names. It's interesting because in Western philosophy, we often make a clear distinction between syntax, the structure of language, and semantics, the meaning.
Yeah, that's a really important point. They saw logic and language as like deeply interconnected. Their big insight was that the rules of logic, what makes a good argument, aren't just about some abstract structure, but also about the meanings of the words themselves. Semantics, understanding Weiming, was like built into their whole approach to logic.
And that brings us to this idea that language has a normative function, which was pretty common in early Chinese thought. Zunzi, who was a Confucian philosopher, but someone who really engaged with Mohist ideas, argued that the main purpose of language was to make clear the difference between right and wrong, to guide behavior and settle ethical disputes.
Exactly. They didn't see language as just a neutral tool. For Zunzi, naming things, it wasn't just about labeling. It was about like shaping reality, influencing how people act, and promoting ethical behavior. The way you used language, it carried real moral weight.
And there's a great quote from Zunzi's Correct Naming that really gets at this, doesn't it?
Yeah, he says, if names are not correct, language will not be in accordance with truth. If language is not in accordance with truth, then affairs cannot be carried on to success. Basically, if you mess up language, if you call things by the wrong names, then you blur the lines between right and wrong, you create confusion, and nothing gets done properly. For him, the whole point of having names was to bring order to the world, to clarify moral categories, and to distinguish between different things.
And this idea that using language correctly is essential for social order, well, that takes us back to Confucius and his emphasis on zhengming, often translated as the rectification of names, but maybe better understood as the ordering of names.
Right. Confucius, he was like the OG of this idea that language is super important for society. He didn't just see it as a way to describe the world, but as a way to, like, make things happen, to create social reality, to bring things into alignment with ethical principles.
There's that famous story about Zilu, right, from the Analects.
Oh, yeah, the one where Zilu asks Confucius, if you were put in charge of a state, what would be your top priority? And Confucius, he doesn't even hesitate. He's like making sure names are used correctly. And Zilu, he's kind of confused, like, what do you even mean by that? And Confucius explains that if names are messed up, then language breaks down, communication falls apart, and everything goes to pot government, rituals, music, laws, the whole shebang. It's a pretty powerful illustration of just how seriously Confucius took language.
And the entry makes the point that ordering of names is a better translation than rectification of names, right? It captures this dynamic aspect of language that Confucius was getting at.
Exactly. Rectification makes it sound like you're just like fixing things to some preset standard. But Confucius understood that language has to adapt, it has to be flexible because, moral problems and social situations, they're always changing. So ordering of names gets at this idea that you have to be actively involved in shaping language, making sure it reflects the current situation, and using good judgment to apply names correctly.
Now, let's zoom in on the Mohists and their specific contributions to, the study of logic and language. The source mentions a few key texts that are essential reading for understanding their perspective.
Yeah, for sure. You've got the writings of the later Mohists, especially those 4 chapters of Book 10 and the first 2 of Book 11 of the Mozi. They're known as the Mohist canons, and they're basically the main source for all their deep thinking about logic and language. You've got the Jingshang, Jingxie, Jingshuoshang, and Jingshuoxi there, plus the Daqua, greater selection, and Jiaqua, lesser selection, from Book 11. These texts, they're like the foundation for anyone interested in the history of logic, even if they're, pretty tough to wrap your head around.
And as the entry points out, these Mohist texts are not, they're not exactly light reading, are they?
Oh, no, not at all. The canons are notoriously dense and a bit cryptic, like they leave a lot unsaid. It's likely that parts are missing. There are probably errors that have crept in over the years, and scholars are, constantly debating about what different passages really mean. People like A.C. Graham have done some amazing work trying to reconstruct and interpret these texts, but there's still a lot of scholarly back and forth.
But even with all those challenges, the Mohist texts show us that they were definitely working with what we would recognize as basic logical notions. What kind of things, stand out there for you?
Despite the difficulties, it's pretty clear that the Moses were using logical operators like, conjunction, disjunction, negation, and implication.
Yeah.
They were also very interested in quantifiers like no or none, and they even used terms that express modality, like by for necessity.
Mm.
Some scholars even think they were starting to use variables in their reasoning, which is like moving towards formalization. It's really remarkable to see them grappling with these concepts that are still so central to logic today.
Yeah, it's amazing to think that these ancient thinkers were already onto something that, we're still using and developing today. It really shows that there's this kind of deep intellectual continuity across time and cultures.
Absolutely. And they went beyond just those basic building blocks. In the Mohist canons, you can find things that look a lot like modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogism, even the laws of non-contradiction and excluded middle. They had a pretty sophisticated grasp of what makes an argument valid, that's for sure.
And there's even something that looks like the liar paradox, right? Which is, for a philosopher who loves a good paradox, that's pretty cool.
Oh, yeah. There's a passage that says, to claim that all saying contradicts itself is self-contradictory, which is, well, it sounds a lot like the liar paradox, a statement that seems to undermine itself. It's hard to imagine that they weren't aware of the weirdness of self-reference and truth. So it suggests they were really pushing the boundaries of logical thought.
They were really into figuring out the rules of the game, so to speak. And the ox and non-ox example, that's a classic one, right?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. They use those contrasting terms, ox and non-ox, to make the point that if someone says something is an ox and someone else says it's not an ox, well, those two statements can't both be true at the same time about the same thing. It's a pretty clear echo of Aristotle's principle of non-contradiction, and their understanding that those two categories, ox and non-ox, cover all the possibilities for a given thing, that points towards an early grasp of the principle of excluded middle.
But the entry makes the point that we shouldn't just equate these Mohist insights with Aristotle's ideas. There are some important differences, right?
Right. The big difference is the overall philosophical framework. Aristotle's logic is based on his theory of predication, which assumes that sentences are structured with a subject and a predicate. Now, there's this debate among scholars about whether early Chinese thought, or even Chinese thought today, works with that same subject-predicate structure. Some argue that they were more interested in, relationships between things and the role of names in a given context, rather than trying to classify things into fixed categories based on predicates.
So when a Most had said this is an ox, they might not have been primarily focused on putting that particular thing into the category of ox. Maybe it was more about establishing a connection or association based on shared features and using the name ox appropriately in that specific situation.
Exactly. And as A.C. Graham suggested, the whole concept of a proposition as a distinct unit of analysis, that might have been a later development in Mohist thought. Earlier on, they might have been more focused on the individual terms and how they combine, rather than on propositions as a whole. And Chad Hansen has argued that their primary concern wasn't truth in the strict logical sense, but rather the practical action-guiding functions of language within a social and ethical context.
And this focus on the practical side of language, that leads to their interest in sameness and difference. What was the thinking behind their exploration of those concepts?
Well, they really wanted to figure out, when can you say that two things are the same and when can you say they're different? And this wasn't just some theoretical puzzle for them. It was really important for their ethical and political arguments because they often relied on making comparisons and distinctions. So they came up with this classification of names, dividing them into unrestricted names, which apply to everything, classifying names, which apply to a group of similar things, and private names, which refer to just one individual. Understanding these categories was crucial for them to argue effectively and make their points.
And their whole art of disputation, which they called Bobian, that really relied on these pairs of contrasting names, right? Like ox and non-ox. It was a way to structure arguments and spot contradictions.
Yeah, exactly. The idea was that any given thing has to fall into one of those two categories, but not both at the same time. It's like a fundamental either. And this is where their understanding of non-contradiction and excluded middle came into play. They were all about naming and reference.
Hmm.
And their reflections on meaning, well, they grew out of this practical engagement with language in the context of debate.
So for them, a valid inference, it wasn't just about following some abstract rules that preserve truth, like in later Aristotelian logic. It was more about the relationships between the meanings of the words involved.
That's a key difference, yeah. While they did start paying more attention to logical and grammatical forms, they were always cautious about relying on those forms alone. They believed that valid inference also had this semantic dimension. It depended on the specific meanings of the terms. So instead of focusing solely on abstract logic, they were more interested in developing a kind of taxonomy of valid inference patterns based on analogies between the meanings of the terms being combined.
And that brings us to their emphasis on analogical reasoning, which they called Unveil. How did they use analogies in their philosophical investigations and arguments?
For the Mohists, a Mayan was a pretty broad term. It encompassed, reasoning, debating, basic cognition, learning, the whole shebang.
Yeah.
But at its core, it was about finding correlations between things based on their similarities and differences, and then drawing conclusions from those distinctions. Now, they recognized that things can resemble each other in all sorts of ways, many of which are, superficial or irrelevant. So to guide this process of correlation, they needed a model or a standard, which they called fa. It was basically like the ideal example of what something should be like.
So to figure out if something, say X, could be called by the name G, they would find a perfect example of a G, let's call it M, and then see if X was similar enough to M in the right ways.
Exactly. If the resemblance was close enough, and it had to be based on the right criteria, then they would say, okay, X is definitely a G. This whole idea of resemblance judged against a model was central to their understanding of valid inference. And because they saw language as primarily about guiding action, the semantic property preserved in valid inference wasn't just descriptive accuracy, but also a kind of normative dimension. It was about what's admissible or appropriate, rather than just what's true in some absolute sense.
But relying on analogies like that, well, it can be tricky, can't it? Because things can be similar in all sorts of ways, and many of those similarities might not really matter. Like a black cat might resemble a black panther in terms of color, but that doesn't make it a panther.
Oh, yeah. They were definitely aware of that problem. They knew that you can't just look at any old similarity. To address this, they came up with this idea of resembling the standard in the appropriate way, which was determined by a specific criterion, yin. So, for example, a square piece of wood resembles a T-square, not because it's also made of wood, but because it has that square shape. The criterion tells you which aspects of the resemblance are actually relevant for using a particular name or for making a valid inference.
And these criteria, they were often based on things you could see or observe, right?
Yeah, things like shape, color, and function were common criteria. But it wasn't just about matching things up visually. They were naming things based on these carefully chosen distinctions, and that required them to understand what the names really meant. This became especially important when they were dealing with more abstract concepts in complex language where, a simple visual model might not be enough.
In that example, comparing loving people to riding horses, that really shows how the same grammatical structure can have very different logical and semantic requirements.
Exactly. For the Mohists, loving people meant loving every single person, no exceptions. That's universal quantification. But riding horses just meant riding at least one horse. That's existential quantification. So they realized that even if two phrases look the same grammatically, they can have very different meanings and require different things to be true. This was a big realization for them, what scholars call a linguistic turn in their thinking.
So they started paying more attention to language itself, trying to figure out how grammatical forms could both reveal and hide the real meanings.
Exactly. They started making lists of parallel linguistic constructions, hoping to find a kind of logic that mirrored those grammatical forms. But as they learned more about the quirks of resemblance, they realized that relying on grammatical analogy alone could be misleading. They saw that those parallels between linguistic expressions, well, they only hold up to a certain point. Sometimes there are semantic differences lurking beneath the surface similarity.
And this realization led them to identify four main techniques of disputation: analogy, pi, parallelizing, bu, pulling, yuan, and pushing, tui. What's the gist of those techniques?
Okay, so those are the basic moves they used in philosophical debates. Analogy, pi, that was about making comparisons to similar cases to make a point. Pulling you on and pushing Tui were about using your opponent's own statements to either support your argument or to, shoot theirs down. But parallelizing Mu, that was considered their most unique and important contribution. It was all about comparing linguistic expressions side by side and using those shared grammatical structures to build an argument.
Like that example, white horses are horses, riding white horses is riding horses. That's what they called forme, right?
Yep. They recognized that pattern in language, and at first, they might have thought that the logic followed the same pattern. But then they found cases where it broke down, like in their Form B examples, things like, robbers are people, but being without robbers is not being without people. By paying close attention to where those grammatical analogies failed, they made some really important discoveries about meaning and logic.
And this brings us to what might be their most impressive insight, their early work on intentionality. It's pretty amazing that they were already thinking about this stuff that, is still a big deal in philosophy of language today.
It really is. The later Mohists seem to have been among the first to really grasp the whole issue of intentionality. They understood that the meaning of a phrase isn't always just the sum of its parts. Sometimes you can't just figure out the meaning by looking at the individual words. They also had a pretty good grasp of the difference between intention, which is like the concept or meaning of a term, and extension, which is the set of things the term refers to.
And they didn't try to, ignore or get rid of these intentional contexts. They actually used them in their philosophical arguments, especially their ethical arguments.
Exactly. They didn't have a formal way of dealing with these semantic subtleties, but they were very careful to note when phrases that looked similar grammatically actually behaved differently in terms of meaning. They would use what we would now call tests for intentionality, often involving verbs like know, think of, and love. They realized that with these verbs, you can't just swap out words that refer to the same thing and expect the sentence to still be true or valid.
And there's that classic example, knowing dogs and knowing canines. That's from B40 of the canons, right?
Right. Dog and canine refer to the same group of animals, but the Mohists realized that someone could know what a dog is without knowing what a canine is, or vice versa. So it shows that the verb know creates a context where you can't just swap out words based on their reference. The way you understand the words, their intention, makes a difference.
And they didn't just look at epistemic verbs like know. In the Xiaoqua, they also analyzed examples with verbs like entering, serving, and even killing, which shows they were really onto something with this intentionality business.
Absolutely. Like that example, entering a boat is not entering wood. Even though a boat is made of wood, they understood that those two phrases don't mean the same thing. It shows they were thinking about whether combinations of words always work in a predictable compositional way, or whether they sometimes have unique meanings that you can't just break down into the individual words.
Mm-hmm.
They're really exploring the nuances of meaning.
And that killing robbers is not killing people example, that's a really interesting one, especially for the ethical implications. What's the Mohist take on that?
Yeah, that one's been debated a lot. It seems they were arguing that killing robbers had this specific moral connotation, like it was about justified execution or punishment, which was different from killing people in general, which could include, straight up murder. That subtle difference in meaning was really important for them because it allowed them to reconcile their principle of universal love with the need to maintain order and punish wrongdoers. It shows how they were using linguistic analysis to support a sophisticated ethical position.
Now let's turn to the Taoists, especially Zhuangzi. He seemed to challenge this whole Mohist idea that you could analyze language to get a reliable guide for action and understanding.
Yeah, Zhuangzi was pretty skeptical about that. He didn't deny that there are real similarities and differences in the world, but he wasn't convinced that language could ever fully grasp those things or tell us how to act in a foolproof way. He thought that true understanding and lived experience went beyond what language could express.
There's that great story about wheelwright Pierre Tien, right?
Oh, yeah, the one where Pien is trying to explain how he makes wheels, and he's like, I can't put it into words. It's a feel, a knack, something you can't teach. It's a perfect illustration of Zhuangzi's view that some kinds of knowledge, like embodied skills and practical wisdom, they just can't be captured in language. You have to learn them by doing.
And Zhuangzi was really interested in those words like this and that, what we call indexicals. He used them to, poke holes in the Mohist idea that words have fixed objective meaning.
Totally. He used those indexical terms to show that the meaning of a word can depend on who's speaking and what the situation is. When you say this, you're always implying that there's another perspective from which it could be called that. It's like built-in relativity, which makes it hard to pin down a word's meaning in a totally objective way.
Now, Zhenzi, the Confucian philosopher, he tried to kind of pick up the pieces after the Taoist critique and reestablish ethical principles, but from a Confucian perspective.
Yeah, Zunzi was definitely influenced by the Mohists, but he was still very much a Confucian. He took Zhuangzi's critique of language and used it to argue that, okay, if language is inherently unstable, then we need social conventions to fix the meanings of words. And he thought those conventions were established by the wise rulers of the past.
So for him, it wasn't reason or utility that determined the correct use of language, like the Mohists thought, but rather tradition and authority.
Exactly. He was all about maintaining social order through, strong leadership and clear hierarchies. He thought that people are naturally selfish and need guidance, which comes from institutions and the conventions of language, all passed down from those in authority. He even went so far as to discourage ordinary people from questioning those established linguistic conventions.
He agreed with the Mohists about needing a model for comparison, but he used it differently, especially when it came to ethics.
Right. The Mohists often appealed to utility to figure out what's right and wrong. But Zunzi believed that what the sage kings did and said was, inherently right. It didn't need any further justification. For him, reason was mainly about applying those established conventions to specific situations, not about questioning the conventions themselves.
And remember that killing robbers example. He had a different take on that than the Mohists, right? He went for a simpler interpretation.
Yeah, he just said killing robbers is killing people.
Yeah.
He didn't buy the Mohist distinction based on moral justification. He thought it was better to use clear, general terms to avoid confusion and to maintain social harmony through clear communication.
And the entry points out that there's a bit of a tension in Zunzi's thinking, right? Between his careful analysis of language and his deference to authority.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. He had this sophisticated theory of how language creates ethical order, but then he just said, okay, but ultimately it's all based on what the Sage King said. It makes you wonder if he wasn't implicitly relying on the same faculties of reason and perception that the Mohists were so focused on. It's like he was trying to have it both ways.
So to wrap things up, we've seen how early Chinese philosophers, especially those later Mohists, made some really groundbreaking contributions to logic and language. They developed sophisticated theories of analogy and were way ahead of their time in understanding intentionality.
They were asking really fundamental questions about the relationship between language, thought, and reality. Questions that, would later become central to Western philosophy. It's a reminder that philosophical inquiry wasn't just happening in ancient Greece, it was happening all over the world.
And we saw how the Taoists challenged the idea that language could perfectly capture reality, and how Zunzi tried to ground language and ethics in tradition and authority.
This whole back and forth between these different schools gives us a really valuable perspective on how philosophers have thought about language, logic, and ethics throughout history. And as a philosopher, you can probably see connections between these ancient debates and contemporary discussions in, philosophy of language, epistemology, maybe even political philosophy.
And that brings us to our final thought for today. Given all this, this rich history of thought in China, where language, logic, and ethics were so intertwined, does it make you wonder if maybe our modern approaches, which tend to be more compartmentalized, are missing something? Maybe these things are more connected than we think. It's something to ponder as you continue your own philosophical journey.
It really is. Think about what it means for our understanding of truth, meaning, rationality, the very basis of our moral and political beliefs. Maybe those ancient Chinese thinkers were onto something about the interconnectedness of philosophical inquiry. It's something worth exploring.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into early Chinese philosophy. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.